Taken from some Israeli site. Someone is wondering, why is Moses here for 40 years, when Alexander the Great made a much longer journey in 11 years? What is behind this difference? Significantly, the inscription below is in Hebrew, and this is reassuring. There is such a point of view that Moses and Susannan are two peas in a pod, and the result is such. Well, in general, there is such an understanding. It is in its essence idiotic, and in relation to both it is slanderous. But it implies that there is nothing serious in both cases. And there is such a point of view. Well, here is the earthly sphere, thimbles, on them the symbolism of the three Abrahamic religions, and this implies that there is a certain global game going on, a so-called game in quotation marks, and the objective is, in general, to dominate it. Well, it also fell so accurately that in this presentation this slide is number 33. The degree of initiation, well, for everyone, regardless of ethnicity, because above 33 there are only God's chosen ones. What is known about ancient Egypt? There were two capitals. In each capital there was a Greek college, 10 in the north and 10 in the south, headed by the 11th High Jrets. There was a pharaoh who was in charge of the state apparatus. Then the strangeness begins, because in books on history written in the 19th century, for example, Vodovozov primary school reader, that is in fact an educational program in self-study, it was said that everything in Egypt was subordinated to the Jretshood. The film The Mummy, the plot is based on what? The High Jrets and the Pharaoh are in conflict over a young lady. As a result, the High Jrets is buried alive, having been previously provided with insects that eat him alive. Well, you see, if in Egypt everything was subordinated to the Jretshood, then this could not have been. If the High Jret says to the Pharaoh, "I need your concubine," then the Pharaoh will respectfully bow down and give a gift to the High Jrets. How this will be externally furnished, this is another question. To say nothing of the fact that in order to be the High Jrets, an individual must not be a slave to his instincts. That is, the plot of The Mummy, it psychodynamically is objectively impossible. That is, it is a fake, the task of which is to create a deliberately false idea of how Egypt was ruled. If you look at the history and organization of governance in ancient Egypt at the time of the pharaohs, it turns out like this. Egypt was governed according to the predictor-corrector scheme. The task of Jretli power is prognostics on the basis of identification of problems, the formation of a conception of governance, and moreover, there are two predictors. This suggests that one of them can be erroneous, both of them can be erroneous, and then the question arises as to how to get rid of the errors. Now, if the participants in both of them possess methodology of cognition and creativity in any form, then to them it should be clear that the difference of opinion is the result of the fact of different informedness, errors of intellectual activity, some psychological factors that cause these very errors. You can get to the bottom of all this, and if you get to the bottom, then, at the output of the process, which is called tandem in the diagram, a conception of governance will appear, free from the errors of the first two initial ones. All that is required is that people would master the methodology of cognition and creativity and would have no claim to personal copyright. That is, the position, I am a great Jrec and you are all nothing. It does not work here. This is an immediate loss of governance. Further, the Pharaoh is a program adaptive module of the system of governance, and he governs it. He is responsible before the Jrecud, but he is also initiated. Therefore, in the processes of working out of the conception, he also takes some part. Well, and further, the state apparatus will implement the conception, and this is already presented to society in the spirit according to the film The Mummy. The Pharaoh is the head of everything, these are faithful servants, although in reality everything is the opposite way around. The Jrecli power is higher than the state power, and it is autocratic. And if you do not possess the methodology of cognition and creativity, then you will not find yourself there, although you can find yourself here being a complete fool. But in this case, someone will somehow manipulate you. And the first contenders to manipulate, this is the Jrecli power. That is, the architecture of the statehood of Egypt during the time of the pharaohs. It is more consistent with the entire function of governance than any architecture of modern states, and accordingly, up to the level of Egypt of the time of the pharaohs, any state has to grow and grow. Nevertheless, Egypt with all its perfection is a thing of the past. Why is it a thing of the past? Because the Jrecud of Egypt were the first to understand this here. And, apparently, having become depraved, decided to achieve undivided world domination by realizing this here. That is, they produced a science, an ideology, which ensured the governance towards those who accept this in correspondence with their tasks. They also somehow mastered this. In general, they gave out this here. And this they imposed on the Jews in culture. And in order to impose it on the Jews in culture, it took 40 years to seal the ancient Jewish society in the desert, in isolation, creating for them their specific living conditions, during which this became the norm of their culture, the meaning of life. The Christians were offered the second part, that is, obey. And this turned out to be quite effective, because in the correspondence between Rozanov and Florensky, there is such an episode. And in the end, there is only one question Do we believe the Bible or not? Do we believe the Apostle Paul or not? We are secondary, among other things. Israel, on the other hand, is the core of world history. This is the supreme will. If we humble ourselves, the joy of the last submission is in our souls. If we persist, we will reject the very Christianity for the sake of which we argued with Israel. That is, again, we will fall under the heel of Israel. The promises of God are immutable. We must ourselves complete our circle of submission to Israel. And truly, no matter how you take things, everything comes out the same. The Old Testament makes and relentlessly reiterates the promises of future world domination. To whom? To the Jews. And the New Testament, it by no means tells us, Christians, that this domination is now passing to us, Christians, but only calls to patiently bear our cross and promises for this salvation. One testament contradicts the other, not because both say one thing, however, but precisely because both say different things, and different things are addressed to different persons. And this deep and fundamental divergence of both testaments, reconciled with the high soaring of spiritual contemplation, as was the case with the Apostle Paul, unbearably cuts and burns our wingless and flabby consciousness. The Quran does not fit into this system of relations. Therefore, the task of eradicating the Quran from history, this is the main task of global politics pursued by the West. But this explains the entire historical past, well, factually, until 1917. Because after 1917, Bolshevism entered the political arena.
После 17 года на политическую арену вышел большевизм. Вышел он.
It entered in the lexicon of Marxism,
но истинными марксистами.
But Trotsky and the Social Democrats of Europe were true Marxists.
Европы, а большевики
And the Bolsheviks were factually anti-Marxists from the beginning, since Marxism is a secular variant of this right here. That is precisely why political economy in Marxism is metrologically inconsistent. That is precisely why the methodology of cognition of dialectical materialism is defective, so that the following principle is realized. Everyone, to the measure of his understanding, works for himself, and to the measure of the difference in understanding, for those who understand more. Therefore, if the methodology of cognition of Marxism is defective, then the one who possesses a more perfect methodology of cognition can create a difference in the world understanding, and, after that, the Marxists work for themselves to the measure of understanding, and to the measure of the difference in understanding for those who understand more and pursue different objectives. This concludes the current conversation. If you have any questions, then we can go to the questions. But all this is impossible to see if one does not look at history through the prism of the sufficiently general theory of governance. And the sufficiently general theory of governance cannot appear and cannot be understood if one does not possess the methodology of cognition and creativity, free from the defects of the dialectics of Marx, Hegel.
Диалектики Маркса, Гегеля.
How can the Quran be eradicated?
The Quran is about 1,300 years ago. Muhammad was born in 570 according to the Christian chronology. The main thing that is unacceptable in the Quran is that usury is regarded as a variety of Satanism.
Does Islam refer to the Quran? Will it also be eradicated, or are they different things?
From their point of view, it should remain in the past. in much the same way as Hitlerism remained in the past. After the defeat of the Third Reich, Germany was subjected to denazification. And therefore, when now such a project as ISIS is developing, but ISIS would not have been able to develop without corresponding funding. But at the same time, ISIS is not worried about scientific technological progress, and accordingly, even if a caliphate arises with claims to become a world caliphate, the caliphate will be inferior in military economic potential to the United States, Japan, China, and it's doomed to military defeat in the event of a war. And further, the Quran is regarded as evil. In every history textbook, it is written that there was such an evil book, and accordingly, it does not arouse interest. That is, there is a project to eliminate Islam, since this here doctrine of buying up the world on the basis of usury, the Quran regards as Satanism.
At the moment, are there any higher educational institutions in which theory of governance is taught?
Maybe one of the teachers in some higher educational institutions recommends students to read it, but I don't know of any higher educational institutions at which courses in theory of governance are taught. Well, this here theory of governance. Because in the past, Vladimir Mikhailovich Zasnobin taught this at the Faculty of Applied Mathematics of Processes of Governance in Peterhof at the university. But after the death of Zubov, the course was discontinued. At the Agrarian University, after Viktor Alexeyevich Yefimov left the post of rector, the teaching of these courses was also stopped. Well, and the current rector simply destroyed the scientific school that Viktor Alexeyevich was creating. And this is not regarded as a corpus delicti.
How do you relate to the theory of the later construction of the pyramids at Giza? Do you think that when they were discovered, then they began to build in this way, casting stones?
This is a question about construction technologies. Because in order to build them, either the transportation of stones from quarries is required, and this is not the easiest task, even with our state of technology, or casting concrete blocks, also problematic. But if we talk about concrete blocks, why not cast them like a monolith using a sliding framework? But then there will be no blocks and stones. In any case, the pyramids are not a product of our mentality, and for what purposes they were built is an open question. Until we understand the purposes for which they were built, there is no reason to talk about how they were built, because the objectives, they determine also the technologies. Well, here is one of the simplest examples. There was the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. It was built with donations from the people. It took a long time to build. But then it was destroyed, and in the 90s, a model of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was built. Here the important thing is that this was a model. Why? Because they wanted as quickly as possible, and therefore, inside the temple, the painting was applied not to the walls, but to a steel jacket, which is located approximately at this distance from the load-bearing walls. The steel jacket shields the interior of the temple from many earthly fields, cosmic fields. And the presence of this steel jacket, which has never been in the construction of any temple in the history of mankind, gives reason to say that this is not the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, but a model. The second circumstance is connected with the fact that when they were building, they took shortcuts. Welding of metal jackets is usually accompanied by welding deformations. If you look at how the template curves fit on this very steel jacket, you will find that the welding deformations are very large. And if this steel jacket was accepted by the quality control department of any shipyard or military acceptance committee, then, for the inconsistency of its forms with theoretical contours, it would not have been accepted. And so, well, there are shortcuts. But again, shortcut work is the result of the fact that the objectives were different. A temple is a kind of resonator of natural fields. But since here the task of being a resonator of natural fields was not set by the customer, then there turned out a model of a temple. Also, if you return to the question of the pyramids, in order to understand them, you need to understand for what they were built, on what physical principles, and what they did. Then it will become clear whether they are good in relation to those tasks, or not so much, why there are such technologies and not some others.